All right. Good morning. I hope everybody had a good weekend and you had some time to rest and you guys are doing well. I know our family's been doing a lot of stuff outside, just kind of in the backyard and having lots of fun. Yesterday, we kind of had a camping day. So the we went out and set up a hammock and we went out into the woods and got some firewood. And we're going to actually have a fire tonight, assuming it doesn't rain. But then we camped out in the living room, and that was pretty fun. So anyway, just good morning if you're just joining us. And I don't know if I showed this class, but I'm setting up my classroom really slowly. So I've got my wonderful, trusty, noble steed behind me, and I've got now my whiteboard, which I borrowed from my daughter. So she thankfully was allowed to, or she allowed me to use her whiteboard. So I've got kind of our topics for today, and I even have an American flag. So I'm pretty happy about that. I feel like I'm getting pretty comfortable. Those of you who are going to watch this later or tuning in right now, we are going to actually do a Google Hangout sometime either late this week or next week. That way we can all just kind of touch base, and it's going to be less about necessarily just this with political conflicts and more just an opportunity for all of us to just kind of hang out. And so text each other, let each other know that we're going to do that hangout at some point. I'll give you an announcement or send you an email about it really soon. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting together and just kind of hanging out for a few minutes, not necessarily talking history, but I'm missing you guys a lot. So I just want to kind of catch up with you and just kind of spend some time together for a while. So if you're interested in that, text each other, let each other know, and we will we'll go from there. So I'm going to get right down to our lesson for today, and then after that, we'll kind of talk about a few things, logistics for later this week and things like that. But so our big question today, if you remember, last week we talked about Isaac Newton and learning. Is our big question that we're going to learn about today is how conflicts between the North and South eventually led to a civil war. And so today's not necessarily going to answer that question. We'll kind of come to that conclusion at the end of looking at each of these major conflicts. But I did want to kind of put that up there today. Our three topics are Missouri Compromise, Nullification Crisis, and Compromise of 1850. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about briefly today. And guys, I'm going to give you kind of an introduction to the whole thing and just these three major conflicts. These are some of the more interesting, kind of more attempts to cool down the tensions between the North and the South. Really, the Nullification Crisis is a pretty scary one that almost leads us to civil war in the 1830s. So we'll talk about those. Tomorrow's lesson, before I forget, is going to have to be pushed back to Wednesday. So I won't do any live streaming tomorrow. We have some teacher meetings that we've got, so we'll be doing those, and it's during this time. So we'll just go ahead and push everything back to Wednesday. So we'll go through our next part of the lesson then. If you're doing your projects before we get started, just feel free. Again, this is an optional assignment. This is for your own learning and something that, it's for you to kind of pursue a passion of yours, whichever one of these, or even if it's multiple, that you find interesting. This is really what you make it. So I pushed out the assignment to you, but again, this is optional. It's for fun. It's for you to be kind of like, Isaac Newton and have the apple hit you on the head with something super interesting that you had not learned before. And speaking of something hitting me on the head, yesterday I was actually in the hammock, and it wasn't an apple, thankfully, that hit me in the head, but the ticks are out. So I had this, I was laying there and relaxing and looking up at the trees and the sky, and all of a sudden, these ticks, multiple, started landing on me. So they're out if you're out in the woods. So make sure you're looking out for those. But yeah, that's what hit me in the head yesterday. So thankfully I was able to catch them and pull them off before they bit me or whatever. So, but anyway, let's get started with Missouri Compromise. So when we're looking at conflicts between the North and the South leading up to the Civil War, 1820 is really where it all starts. So you got a guy by the name of Talmadge, last name Talmadge, who introduces this bill to admit Missouri as a free state. And that really starts to kind of upset people because at the time, there's kind of a balance. There's really a balance between slave states and free states. And so why that matters is in Congress, Southern states primarily are concerned about not having as much power as Northern states. And while slavery kind of exists in both Northern and Southern states, by the 1820s, there's sort of this attitude of anti-slavery. It's kind of the abolitionist movement is kind of getting into full swing. You've got papers like the Liberator and people starting to speak out against it. And so Southerners really see that as kind of their way of life, while the North has kind of turned to kind of industrial culture, or is turning toward industrial culture and less reliant on slavery. The South is heavily reliant on slavery for things like cotton and tobacco, mainly. So Southern congressmen are really worried about this, and Southerners in general are kind of upset by the idea that these new states would be entering as exclusively free states where slavery would not exist. And so that kind of starts the frustrating debates. But again, I think I've told you about my favorite historical figure, Henry Clay, who's kind of right in the middle of this whole thing. And basically what happens is there's debate, there's a lot of frustration, and Maine is seeking to be admitted to the Union as well at this point in time. And what happens is basically Henry Clay is able to kind of help to move people. He's referred to as the great compromiser, and he kind of helps them compromise by, Missouri is admitted as a slave state in the end with the Missouri Compromise. Maine enters as a free state, which maintains the balance between slave states and free states and helps people to kind of agree with that. And then there's this line, the 3630 line, which is the southern border of Missouri, that is established. And it's a really interesting story that I encourage you to look into a lot more. But the 3630 line basically serves as the line between slave and free states for future states that are going to enter out west. So if you take a look at a map of the United States, you can see that the southern border of Missouri, if you draw it all the way out through California, leaves fairly little territory for slave states to enter in the future. And at least at that point, we haven't had the Mexican-American War, where we're going to gain a lot more territory there. But there's a lot more territory to the north where, states could enter as free states. And so even then, even though there is a compromise between slave and free states, it still is kind of this thing that Southerners are pretty kind of iffy about, or at least supporters of slavery, because geographically, there's just not as much land below the 3630 line as there is above. And so anyway, that is going to cause some tensions later on, which we'll get to later on. So really the three main things that come out of this are Missouri's enters as a slave state, even though it's to the north of the 3630 line. The 3630 line is the border between free states to the north and slave states to the south, anyone entering in the future. And then Maine is admitted as a free state. So at the end of that whole thing, it's kind of a compromise, but really it sets the stage. I mean, the debate is started with Southerners and Northerners, and up to this point, there may have been talks in Congress about the North and the South, but really the North and the South start to develop these distinct identities, even though slavery does still exist in the North, even during the Civil War. So, but then by the late 1820s, you've got this kind of interesting thing that happens with a tariff. So the United States federal government passes a tariff on goods, and there you get a state, South Carolina, which is conveniently in the South, and it's going to be the first state that actually secedes from the Union at the start of the Civil War. They don't like the tariff. They don't want to pay it, and they're not happy about it. And if those of you who studied Andrew Jackson, or if you remember our discussion about Andrew Jackson, his vice president for a time is a guy by the name of John C. Calhoun. And John C. Calhoun is really angry. He's from South Carolina, and he he's really angry about the whole idea of a a tariff, the federal government's tariff, and so he seeks to do something about it. And basically, he comes out with this what is called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And he basically says, South Carolina, if they don't like what the federal government is doing, then they can nullify it or effectively ignore the tariff and not have to pay it. And at the time, by 1832, there's another tariff that's passed that kind of makes this whole situation come to a really bad standoff. But John C. Calhoun kind of gives up, resigns from the vice presidency because Jackson and him don't really get along very well. And it's pretty funny because John C. Calhoun is threatened by Andrew Jackson. I mean, he speaks out against Jackson, who's the president, and Jackson threatens to come down and basically hang him from the first tree that he sees. That's near, like, almost word for word what he says. And John C. Calhoun reflects about it and was legitimately scared that was going to happen. So anyway, what happens at the end of the Nullification Crisis is in 1833, both sides kind of agree because Jackson at that point has got a force bill from Congress, which basically allows him to bring the military in and force South Carolina to pay the tariff if he wishes. And he's threatening to do it. And eventually they kind of agree to gradually reduce the tariff over time. And so that kind of avoids a major conflict. But the big question, the significance of that when you look into this, and if you're doing your project on this, is that the question is, does a state have the right to ignore the federal government? We have examples of this happening today with states ignoring federal laws, and the federal government has to decide whether they're going to compel that state to whether to compel the state to agree or comply or not. And we had situations with when universal healthcare came out, where states were ignoring that universal healthcare law, and the courts ended up having to force the states to comply. And so anyway, it's a big question. Does the state have the right to ignore federal laws just if they don't agree with them? And it's going to cause that more tension between the North and the South, because Southerners in their minds see that slavery eventually might be called to question as to whether or not it should be outlawed. And South Carolina, or at least the people like John C. Calhoun, believe that they have the right to ignore any of those new laws that they might not agree with. And so the precedent has been set for the future. So we're going to jump way ahead. There's a lot of conflicts you could look at, some kind of more minor conflicts. There's a lot of anti-slavery information, and the anti-slavery movement really goes, it gets into full swing in the 20s and 30s, and by the 40s and 50s, it's going full bore with a lot of anti-slavery newspapers and people demonstrating. And so you could look into that. That's a great place. You've got really influential women who kind of step up there too, and kind of voice their concerns. And that's a great spot to look if you're interested. But the final thing that we're going to talk about today is the Compromise of 1850. And there's 5 major things that happen here. And again, I'm really trying to give you kind of an intro before you kind of dive into this if you find it interesting. But basically, the first thing is that California is admitted as a free state. And we've gained by that point a lot of land from the Mexican-American War that we didn't have time to talk about in class, but basically it adds more territory to the United States and settles, basically forms the final borders of the United States, or just about, that we know today. But the Mexican Cession, which is it's a piece of land that basically is Utah and New Mexico in the Southwest. It is organized, and those territories are organized eventually to become states at some point in the future. And but there's no mention of slavery, and those territories are both, for the most part, below the 3630 line. So you can see how that's kind of a conflict too, where slavery is not really mentioned in that territory. They haven't really decided what they're going to do when those states, if and when those states start to come into the Union or try to. The borders between Texas and Mexico New Mexico are settled with some money that's exchanged. But the big two kickers, and Henry Clay's right in the middle of this. He's kind of brokering these deals in 5 different bills of Congress. But one of them is the fugitive slave law, which basically says if you're a slave, an escaped slave, that Northerners mainly are forced to return those slaves to the South. And so there's going to be some issues with that as to whether or not people who are living in the North who don't support slavery are going to comply with that. And Southerners are going to get really heated over the fugitive slave law not being enforced like they want it. And Northerners that's going to lead to more conflict between Northerners and Southerners. And the final thing is the slave trade being established in D.C. Abolished in D.C. That is going to kind of signify to Southerners that the end of the war, the end of compromise is near. That the writing is on the wall. It's only a matter of time before a political party picks up anti-slavery as part of their platform or their belief system, and so. The writing's kind of on the wall at that point. And Southerners it's going to increase tension. And so, 1850, it's 10 years out from the Civil War. So really the majority of our last conflicts that we have are going to be focused on that 10-year period leading up to, the start and the secession by South Carolina. This is where you get to see, we'll start talking about Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant when we get into the Civil War, and we'll have some fun with that. We'll learn about how Robert E. Lee was voted most likely to secede in his class at West Point. So look for some fun stuff there later, and maybe even Abraham Lincoln will show up one day, depending on if he can grow his beard out in time. So, but anyway, thanks for tuning in, and that's kind of our lesson for the day. But I just want to let you know again, you can follow me on Twitter, Mr. Barbie AD. I will post these links out. You can subscribe and like my YouTube channel. That will help out. Sometimes it's difficult to get on these if the videos are not approved. And so look for, if you don't get to watch them live, if you want to come back later and look at them, I'll approve them all so that they're accessible to you. Because sometimes there's some blocking that goes on that prevents people from jumping on. But anyway, I won't be on tomorrow because I have a teacher meeting. So Wednesday we'll cover the next segment. And then again, I'm going to be looking into a Google Hangouts or session for all of us at some point in the future. So guys, I miss you. There's a discussion board post that if you want to reply to, you can. It basically centers around this question here and then gives you some questions about this to kind of look into. If you're following along and doing an assignment and this is one of your topics, these are 3 of my favorites. But you can continue to do that. Again, it's an optional assignment, but I gave you a discussion post. There, you got your activity that you can do. You can just go at this at your own pace. It's all in what you make it. And so I'd continue to encourage you, be like Isaac Newton, keep learning. And we'll be back on here Wednesday and we'll continue our discussion. So I hope everybody's doing well. I really miss you guys. I'm trying to get my classroom all set up here. Hopefully it looks a little bit nicer than last time. But anyway, look for more information. I'll email you and I'll probably be posting on under announcements. I'll post our next live stream channel and our next or when our Google Hangout meeting will be. So guys, I hope you guys are all doing well. And just I'd be interested to hear from you guys. If you want to shoot me an email until our actual Hangout session, that'd be great. I'd love to hear from you and just kind of hear what you guys are up to and how you're doing. And if you guys need anything, I'm here for you. So don't hesitate to reach out. Let me know what you need, and I'll do my best to help you out. But this is some pretty crazy time in U.S. history and in world history. And so just keep fighting the fight and keep hope alive. And I miss you guys. And I look forward to being with you guys real soon. See you later.